Rock and roll music started in the 1950s, but a version of that called alternative rock came about in the 70s, gaining its peak popularity in the 90s. The trend is still going today, with artists like Three Doors Down, Green Day, Imagine Dragons, and many, many more. In today's episode of From Laura's Perspective, I'm going to discuss how this genre of music, known as alternative rock, came about and has changed and evolved ever since. But before I start doing that, I want to give a warm welcome to anyone who's new to my channel. I, Laura Youngblood, post a new video essay at least once a week on a topic that interests me and is sure to interest many of you. This topic may be music, like it is today, or it may be film or television, or it could be theater, or food, drink, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, or nature. If you're looking for a YouTube channel with interesting, informative videos on versatile topics of that nature, my channel's the one for you. So smash that subscribe button and press your fingertip on the notification bell, and on the right one depending on whether you want your phone to go off every time I post new content or only when I post content on the particular topic that drew you to my channel in the first place. But for now, let's discuss the topic of a particular genre of music called alternative rock. Let's start by learning how alternative all began and why it's even called that.
When you hear the term alternative, you might be thinking, alternative to what exactly? Well, before the dawn of this genre, popular music tastes were dictated by music executives within large entertainment corporations. Record companies signed contracts with those entertainers who were thought to become the most popular and therefore who could generate the most sales. Bands that could be considered alternative today are the ones record companies excluded due to their inability to generate the desired record sales. The use of the term alternative to describe this kind of rock music originated around the mid-1980s. At the time, the comic music industry terms for cutting-edge music were new music and postmodern, respectively indicating freshness and a tendency to recontextualize sounds of the past. A similar term, alternative pop, emerged around 1985 and is actually still in pretty high use today. In its early days, any intentionally non-mainstream act that was not influenced by heavy metal ballads, rarefied new wave music, or high-energy dance music fell under the category of alternative rock. In the late 1990s, the definition became more specific. In 1997, Neil Strauss of the New York Times defined alternative rock as hard-edged rock distinguished by brittle, 70s-inspired guitar riffing and singers agonizing over their problems until they take on epic proportions. Defining music as alternative is often difficult because of two conflicting applications of the word. Alternative can describe music that challenges the status quo and is, quote-unquote, fiercely iconoclastic, anti-commercial, and anti-mainstream. And the term is also used in the music industry to denote, quote-unquote, the choices available to consumers via record stores, radio, cable television, and the internet. However, alternative music has paradoxically become just as commercial and marketable as mainstream rock, with record companies using the term alternative to market music to an audience that mainstream rock just doesn't reach. Now that we have a little bit of background on alternative rock, let's learn about some of the earliest examples of alternative. In its early days of the 1980s, alternative rock was an underground phenomenon. What I mean by that is it hadn't gained much popularity due to its boundary-pushing nature. Alternative rock music of this decade was mostly played on independent record labels, fanzines, and college radio stations. Alternative bands built underground followings by touring constantly and by regularly releasing low-budget albums. In the case of the United States of America, New bands would form in the wake of previous bands, which created an extensive underground circuit in America, filled with different scenes in various parts of the country. Although 1980s alternative music wasn't particularly successful and isn't well remembered today, more notable alternative acts that formed later on wouldn't even exist, let alone become as successful as they are, if not for the influence of 80s alternative. On September 10, 1988, an alternative songs chart was created by Billboard, listing the 40 most played songs on alternative and modern rock radio stations in the U.S. The first number one song was Susie and the Banshees' Peekaboo. By 1989, the genre had become popular enough that a package tour featuring New Order, Public Image Limited, and the Sugar Cubes toured the United States arena circuit. Now let's learn about alternative music in its golden age. By the early 1990s, the music industry was enticed by alternative rock's commercial possibilities, and major labels had already signed Jane's Addiction, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Dinosaur Jr. In early 1991, REM went mainstream worldwide with Out of Time, while becoming a blueprint many alternative bands started to go off of. The release of Nirvana's single Smells Like Teen Spirit in September 1991 helped the grunge subgenre take off, something I'll go into more detail about later. Helped by constant airplay of the song's music video on MTV, their album Nevermind was selling 400,000 copies a week by Christmas 1991, much to the music industry's surprise. In addition to popularizing grunge, Nevermind made alternative rock music much more culturally and commercially viable. It heralded a new openness to alternative rock, so to speak, among commercial radio stations, opening doors for heavier alternative bands in particular. In the wake of Nevermind, alternative rock found itself dragged kicking and screaming into the mainstream, and recording companies, confused by the genre's success yet eager to capitalize it, scrambled to sign bands. Many early alternative bands rejected record deals, tours, and merchandising franchises as it conflicted with the rebellious DIY ethic the genre had espoused before mainstream exposure and their ideas of artistic authenticity. In the late 1990s, alternative rock style changed due to a number of events, notably the death of Nirvana's Kurt Cobain in 1994, Pearl Jam's lawsuit against concert venue promoter Ticketmaster, and Soundgarden's breakup in 1997. In addition to the decline of grunge bands, the Britpop subgenre faded as Oasis's third album, Be Here Now, received lackluster reviews, and Blur began to incorporate influences from American alternative rock. Now let's learn about some of the most recent music in this genre. Even to this day, not only is alternative rock still very present, but very popular among youth. What's changed most about the genre, however, is its mainstream style and sound. Post-grunge, a subgenre of the grunge genre, remained commercially viable into the start of the 21st century, when bands like Creed and Matchbox 20 became among the most popular rock bands in the United States. While Britpop was on the decline, Radiohead achieved critical acclaim with its third album OK Computer and its follow-ups Kid A 2000 and Amnesiac 2001, which were in marked contrast with the traditionalism of Britpop. American rock band Red Hot Chili Peppers experienced something of a commercial revival in 1999 after the release of their album Californication, with continued success throughout the 2000s. 30 Seconds to Mars became notably more popular during the latter half of that decade. Most references to alternative rock music in the United States past 2010 are to the indie rock genre, a term that previously had limited limited usage on alternative rock channels and media. Radio stations in the 2010s have been changing formats away from alternative rock, but this is mostly motivated by conglomeration efforts coupled with advertisers seeking more top 40, top 100 stations for sales. When I say that the sound of alternative rock has changed in recent times, I mostly mean that contemporary alternative bands tend to fuse medical elements of hard rock, electronica, hip-hop, indie, and punk while placing emphasis on keyboards and guitar. One of the best and most recent examples of this is probably alternative band 21 Pilots. Their songs are pretty much a rock music gumbo of hip-hop, emo, rock, indie pop, and reggae. In fact, these lines between these genres are so blurred in 21 Pilots music that people actually debate which one it should be categorized under. Now that we know the history of alternative rock, let's talk about what makes a song alternative. One of the fundamental characteristics of music that comes from an artist who can be considered alternative is that their music generally rejects the commercialism and other accepted ideas of mainstream culture. Some might consider this ironic, given that many major alternative acts have themselves made their way into mainstream culture. But even these acts write songs with some socially boundary-pushing themes, such as drug use, depression, physical and mental illness, suicide, self-harm, political and religious corruption, and environmental destruction. There's no set musical style for alternative rock, or the subgenres I'm going to discuss in the next section. But generally speaking, alternative songs contain a guitar at the forefront and are likely to have one that uses power chords to create harsh, loud sounds. Some of said sounds include, but aren't limited to, chiming riffs, buzzing fuzz tone, and squealing feedback. The different types of alternative rock should probably all get videos of their own, but for right now, I'm just going to talk about each of them just a little bit. Let's start with grunge. Alt-rock band Nirvana technically gave birth to the grunge subgenre. Also called Seattle Sound for its hometown, grunge fuses elements of punk rock and heavy metal, but without punk's structure and speed. The genre featured the distorted electric guitar sound used in both genres, although some bands perform with more emphasis on one or the other. Lyrics are typically angst-filled and introspective, often addressing themes such as social alienation, self-doubt, abuse, neglect, betrayal, social and emotional isolation, addiction, psychological trauma, and a desire for freedom. Examples of grunge bands include Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains. Next, let's talk about indie rock. Indie's another alternative subgenre that was inspired by Nirvana. Indie rock was formulated as a rejection of alternative rock's absorption into the mainstream by artists who could not or refused to cross over, and wariness of its macho aesthetic. The alternative genre was quite male-dominated for a while, but the indie subgenre established itself as a place for women within that genre. It could also almost be said that indie rock is the feminist of the alternative subgenres. I didn't know this for a long time, but indie is actually a slang term for independent. In the case of indie rock, this music is generally released by independent record labels. Examples of indie bands include Pavement, Superchunk, and Fugazi. Nostalgia is fundamental to both the lyrical themes and instrumentation of indie rock, drawing influence from psychedelic and garage rock, the latter of which is another subgenre I'll discuss later on. A trend unique to indie rock is that it references literature sometimes, something that appeals to me as someone with an English degree. Emo was one subgenre that defined the turn of the millennium for the alternative genre. When emo emerged on the scene, it had a much more mainstream sound than in the 1990s and a far greater appeal amongst adolescents than its earlier incarnations. At the same time, the use of the term emo has expanded beyond the musical genre, becoming associated with fashion, a hairstyle, and any music that expressed the same kind of emotion expressed in the emo subgenre. Speaking of which, hence its name, whereas the lyrics in other genres of alternative tend to be political in nature, be rather numb in emotion, and be very matter-of-fact and to the point, emo songs tend to be very emotional and confessional. Themes of these lyrics include heartbreak, self-loathing, physical and emotional pain, insecurity, suicidal thoughts, and emotional trauma. Emo uses the guitar dynamics that use both the softness and loudness of punk rock music. Some emo uses characteristics of progressive music with the genre's use of complex guitar work, unorthodox song structures, and extreme dynamic shifts. Some of the most popular examples of emo rock are My Chemical Romance, who I've made an artist analysis about, Fall Out Boy, Paramore, and Jimmy Eat World. Next up is garage rock, one of alternative's precursor genres. The name refers mostly to a similar sound that was popular in the 1960s, but it's recently experienced a revival. The style of this genre is characterized by basic chord structures played on electric guitars and other instruments, sometimes distorted through a fuzz box, as well as often unsophisticated and occasionally aggressive lyrics and delivery. Its name derives from the perception that groups were often made up of young amateurs who rehearsed in the family garage, although many were professional. Last but not least, we have alt pop, a subgenre that's especially popular in 2023. The name's pretty self-explanatory. It has the lyrical themes and some of the harsh, dark sound of alternative rock, but is fused with sounds of contemporary pop. Alt pop acts that are popular today, such as Lana Del Rey, Imagine Dragons, Billie Eilish, and Lorde, make it a point to speak to the dark sides of the 21st century teenage experience, particularly using songs with lyrics that touch on insecurity, regret, drugs, and anxiety. Thank you all so much for listening to me break down the history, characteristics, cultural impact, and subgenres of the alternative rock genre. I've also done this with bluegrass music and plan to do it with many other types of music. I've made a lot of videos about music in general here at From Laura's Perspective, including artist analysis videos breaking down the beginnings, stylings, and achievement of artists across many genres. But not all of my videos are even about music either. I've made video essays concerning many different topics, which you'll have to go to my playlist under my channel page to find out. Next week's will be on an event in our history and on the subject of disabilities and disability justice. If you haven't already, click subscribe and tap the bell so you get the notification once it goes up.